So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Nobody else wants to sit at the table. There's room. I think everything is like tilted. Good thing we're not on a boat or we'd sink. So we're on only this one side. Hey Abe, how's it going? Now you don't have we got a longer HDMI cord, so now you don't have to look at my ear the whole time, Abe. Just for you. I want you to know that you'll see the links that we'll go to for you. All right. All right. So let's jump in. So Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we come before you, and I pray that as iron sharpens iron, that we would sharpen one another, and that we would get everything that you would have for us out of this class. And so we lift up this time to you in the name of Yeshua. Amen. All right. So we've actually been progressing through this class pretty quickly. So what I'm kind of thinking, let me close this door, is that this will probably be the last, unless we don't get to everything, this will be the last like formal class for this series on Introduction to Messianic Judaism. And then what I'm thinking about doing is, instead of trying to cover more stuff for this class, of doing a study on the Passover Haggadah or something related to Passover, since we're coming up to Passover. So absolutely. What's that? Does that sound interesting? We'll cover some how-tos in it for sure. So maybe that's the thing to do, is to kind of go over stuff related to Passover. So before we get started, is there any questions related to stuff we've already covered in this class so far? We went through a lot of practices, and I know we just quickly touched on, the holidays, because you could do a class on every single holiday, right? And you could do a class on every single life cycle and stuff. But if there's, and there'll be opportunity to ask questions as we progress through this. So, this week we're going to be focusing on the foundations of Messianic Jewish theology, like some of the unique aspects in the way in which we understand Scripture, the way that we understand, just kind of the world around us. So, if you have your outlines, the majority of scholars today recognize, and this should not be new information to you by this point. The majority of scholars today recognize that the New Testament is thoroughly Jewish, and that to understand the proper context of Yeshua and his earliest followers, it is incumbent to understand the Jewish context out of which he emerged, right? So again, even if you don't know these exact details, this should not be much of a surprise, but this is the reason why we are so committed to Jewish life renewed in Yeshua is because it's exactly what Yeshua and the disciples did, right? So if we look at, for example, Yeshua and his observance of the Torah, we see that Yeshua, for example, was born and raised in Israel, right? Wasn't in Rome, it wasn't in France, right? It wasn't in the United States. He was born and raised in Israel. And I have some supporting verses for all these things that you can look at if you don't believe me. He was born to an observant Jewish family, meaning like they were pretty committed. The fact that a good example of this is that they would go every year to the temple for Passover, which already by the time of Yeshua, even though the Torah tells us that on the pilgrimage holidays, there are 3 pilgrimage holidays, which in biblical times you were required to go to the temple. Does anybody remember what those 3 are? Passover, Shavuot, and you said tabernacles? Yeah, Sukkot, right. Tabernacles is the English name for it. So in biblical times, those were the pilgrimage festivals. You were expected to go to Jerusalem. And this is why, for example, in Acts chapter 2, it was during a pilgrimage festival that the events of Acts chapter 2 take place, because it was on Pentecost, meaning Shavuot is what we call it in Hebrew. And so that's why there are Jews from all over the world, right? And that there were Jews speaking all kinds of different languages is because it was a pilgrimage festival. So people were coming from all over the known world. Um, but already by the time of Yeshua, it had become commonplace, especially because by this point, Jews live all over the various countries, to send a representative. So maybe not every single Jew would go for the pilgrimage holidays. Instead, a town would pool resources and send a representative. And so even in Israel, this was common. And yet, even though Yeshua's town probably sent a representative, his parents still went every single year. It just shows how committed and how devout that they were. We know that Yeshua had what's called a Brit Milah, right? He was circumcised on the 8th day, according to Luke chapter 2. He was redeemed as a firstborn son, what's called Pidyon Haben, according to Luke 2, and this comes from Exodus and some other places in Scripture. He wore tzitzit, like the fringes, right? Because it talks about times when, for example, the woman with the issue of blood, she reached out and touched. Does everybody know what I mean by tzitzit? That on a prayer shawl has 4 special knots, right? Like this, they're tassels that have a unique number of knots and everything. We talked about a talit last week, I think it was, or the week before. Yeah. Oh, yeah, on the picture over here on the wall. So these are not tzitzit, like on this picture. These little tassels are not tzitzit. It's the ones on the corners, on the 4 corners. And that's from Numbers 15:37, right? It says, put tzitzit on the corners of your garments. So that's what Yeshua was wearing. I was going to mention that in one of the examples, there are actually several places that mention Yeshua wearing tzitzit. But one of the great examples is with the woman with the issue of blood, who knew if she just reached out and grabbed hold of the tzitzit on Yeshua's robe, that she would be healed. And why? Because I think in this class, I mentioned that the tzitzit represent both the name of God and the commandments of the Torah, right? And so there's this sense if she grabbed hold of like the authority that was represented through the tzitzit, and especially on Yeshua, that she would be healed. And that's exactly what happened. Yeshua prayed, taught, and participated in the synagogue. He worshiped and taught in the temple in Jerusalem. He observed the Jewish holidays and festivals. He taught and continued to observe the Torah. And he never intended to start a new religion apart from Judaism. His life and work was committed to the spiritual renewal of the Jewish people. In Matthew 15:24, and there's another place also in the Gospels where Yeshua says, but Yeshua answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We know that ultimately his message was intended to go further than that, but Yeshua himself in his own lifetime, there's only one time he ever intentionally goes to an area where there are Gentiles, and that's when he crossed over the lake and went to the Decapolis. The Decapolis means like the 10 cities. And that was an area that was not Jewish. Not that there weren't some Jews who lived there, but it was the only time in his whole ministry that we have recorded where he intentionally went to an area which was predominantly Gentile. Now, he has encounters, for example, with the Samaritan woman. Samaritans are kind of an in-between people, for lack of a better term. Like they practice a form of Judaism, but they were a people who were mixed, right? They mixed like where Jews who remained after the Babylonian exile mixed with people who were resettled there by the Assyrians. And so Jews, unfortunately throughout history, and it's not only in Israel, there's always been negative perceptions of people who are of mixed descent, right? And this is where you get stupid terms like half-breed and stuff like this. And so unfortunately, Israelites viewed the Samaritans in the same way. They were mixed race people, and so they were tended to look down upon. And this is why there are tensions between the Samaritans and Jews. However, it's also they're so similar and so close that this is why there's such animosity between them, right? Because they practice a form of Judaism, and they have synagogues and they pray in Hebrew and all this kind of stuff. And so, often it's those we're the closest to that you're the most, sometimes the most difficult with. Um, so any questions as far as Yeshua goes? I mean, again, this should be pretty straightforward, but it's important that we mention it, right? To just kind of establish a foundation. The same thing goes with Paul. A lot of times the myth goes, especially among Jews who don't believe in Jesus, it's like Jesus was okay, but Paul came along and messed everything up, right? He's the one who invented Christianity. However, when you actually read closely what Acts says and the message of Paul in his own writings, we know that Paul, or his Hebrew name was Saul, Shaul, and Paulos was his Greek name, his Latinized name. He was born in an area called Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem under the tutelage of the great sage Gamaliel, according to Acts 22. And he was groomed, if we believe, which we do, I'm not questioning but I'm just saying, if you take the account of the New Testament seriously, he was basically groomed to be the next Nasi, which is like the next great leader of the Jewish people. Gamaliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, and that's what the head of the Sanhedrin is called, the Nasi. Nasi in Hebrew gets translated differently. In the Tanakh and in the Torah, it's usually referred to as like a prince or a head of a group. It's on your sheet, and I have it Nasi. If you see like the second bullet point under Paul. So the Nasi was the head of the Sanhedrin. Okay. And Paul says of himself in Galatians that he excelled above all the other students that he studied with, right? Like he was not just studied with Gamaliel, but he was Gamaliel's greatest student. So he was basically being led to, trained to eventually become, not immediately, but eventually he was showing such, I mean, he was a prodigy. He was born in Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem. Like he was raised with Gamaliel, right, at the feet of Gamaliel, which means is a term for discipleship. So when it says like Miriam and Martha, in that story, it says, I think it's Martha who is the one who sits at the feet. I always get them. Is it Miriam or no? Miriam. I always get them reversed. Miriam is the one, right? And Martha is the one who's like, why don't you help me out? But when it says she was sitting at Yeshua's feet, which is an idiom of discipleship, sitting at his feet means she was one of his disciples, and she was more interested in listening to what Yeshua was teaching. And Yeshua then tells Martha, she's actually she's the one with her priorities in order. It doesn't mean that what Martha was doing was wrong, but don't ridicule Miriam because she wants to hear, the message that's being. So this is why when Paul becomes a believer, it's such a big deal, not only for the followers of Yeshua, because now the guy who was out persecuting them becomes a believer in Yeshua, but then for the side of the religious establishment, their kind of star pupil is now went off the path of what he was supposed to. So that kind of makes sense when you understand the tensions. But Paul himself, he becomes, and he's appointed by the Jerusalem Council and by James to be the emissary to the Gentiles, right? So this is why his message and his letters are primarily directed to a Gentile audience, but he himself always remained a religious Jew, right? He maintained Torah observance and temple worship following his faith in Yeshua. And you can read this in Acts 17 and Acts 21, right? In fact, when he is captured and where he spends the rest of his days in prison, what was he doing? He was offering sacrifices in the temple. He actually took a vow. If you remember, James told him, like, listen, there are people, Paul, who are going around saying that you're telling Jews that they shouldn't observe the Torah, right? And that they can basically live however they want. So in order to prove to them that this is not what you're teaching, take on a Nazirite vow, which is a very strict vow that in temple times a person could take on, either for a period of time or, like in the case of Samson, was a Nazirite from birth. But many people could take it on for a period of time. Like you take on a certain level of piety as a season of commitment. And so James tells Paul, pay for, shave your head and do all the stuff that's you're supposed to do in preparation for the Nazirite vow, and then pay for yourself and those with you to take on this Nazirite vow as a way to prove to other people that you still follow the Torah and that you're not teaching people um, to disregard the Torah. Does that make sense? And his writings must be understood not only within a Jewish context, but also meaning the framework in which he's coming from. But one of the there's two things to getting Paul correctly, because most people misunderstand his letters, not only because he's difficult to understand, and even Peter writes that Paul's very difficult to understand, but there are two things you need to get right. Number one is his audience. He's not talking to Jews. And so when he's talking about observances and holidays and fasts, he's not talking about Jewish holidays. He's talking about pagan celebrations because that's his audience, right? And he's saying you shouldn't be doing these things because it's pagan, right? And so when he's talking about food and stuff like that, you have to consider his audience. The other thing that is important is he never contradicts the decision that was established prior to him in Acts 15, that Gentiles do not have to convert to Judaism in order to be saved. So when he says, what good is it to you to be circumcised? He means it in the sense of like, he's trying to combat those who were going around teaching that you need to be circumcised, meaning convert to Judaism in order to be followers of Yeshua. Now, it doesn't mean that the New Testament forbids conversion, but what Acts 15 clearly establishes is it's not required to convert to Judaism or be Jewish in order to be a follower of Yeshua, right? That's really, really, really important. And so if you get this idea and understand who his audience is, this is a religious Jew who's, speaking from a religious context, and he's not going to contradict Acts 15, then it at least helps to set a foundation then for approaching Paul's letters. That his audience is probably predominantly Gentile, right? And he's dealing with issues that are concerned to the Gentiles in the diaspora. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And including, I just gave you an example of Yeshua and Paul, but even of the Talmidim, I'll just give you two examples of their commitment to still following the Torah. In Acts 21:20, we read, who wants to read that verse? Acts 21:20. Okay.
When they heard it, they praised God. Then they said to him, you see, brother, how many tens of thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the Torah.
Right. In many of your translations, we'll see zealous for the law, but it's the same thing, right? It talks about how many tens of thousands of followers in Jerusalem there are, and the environs, not just Judea, but just around Jerusalem. And it says they are all followers. They're zealous, not just followers, but they're zealous for the Torah. And then who wants to read a couple of these verses from Acts, more from Acts 2?
Breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord continued to add to them those who were being saved. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Phoebian. So you see here that they continue to meet daily in the temple, right? And they were still doing sacrifices and stuff and giving offerings until the temple was destroyed. And then usually on Saturday nights, they would go meet in each other's homes where they would break bread, meaning that they were probably taking the Eucharist. They were doing the Lord's Supper, and that they were living in gladness and simplicity, praising God and having favor of all the people. This is important to realize. Even those who were not followers of Yeshua had respect for the commitment of the followers of Yeshua. And the Lord kept adding to them daily those who were being saved. So the earliest followers of Yeshua continued to live covenant faithful Jewish lives. They worshiped in the temple and synagogues. They maintained commitment to Torah faithfulness. And they all understood Yeshua and his teachings from within a Jewish contextual framework, right? It's now going to be another generation or so until there starts to be a large number of Gentile followers of Yeshua. Not that there weren't some immediately already, as Paul is going around spreading the message,
more and more are coming. But, for the first century or so, the followers of Yeshua were still predominantly Jewish. Any questions so far? Again, this should not be new information to most of you. Okay, we're going to talk about some kind of key foundational principles when we think about Messianic Jewish theology. One is a fancy term called bilateral ecclesiology. I'll explain what that means in a second. It's, in theology or any academia, you have these $5 words, right? Or $10 words. And then we'll just unpack it. Lateral, right, means like the same level. And so bi just means that you have two communities that are on equal footing. But bilateral ecclesiology says that within the wider ecclesia, meaning the body of Messiah, what is often translated the church, is you have these two distinct entities that make up the body of Messiah, Jews and Gentiles, right? And they're equal. The bilateral means, two distinct yet equal communities within the body of Messiah, that God has a specific role for the Jews and a specific role for the nations within the body of Messiah, and that working together in the sense of mutual blessing, that together we will bring about the return of Messiah, right? Not we on our own, but you know what I mean? Like by us working together, that the closer we get to the return of Messiah, the closer we will see that God brings, the Jews and the church together, especially Jewish believers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't mean that, as we've talked about before, we're not anti-church. It doesn't mean they're not legitimate criticisms. But at the same time, I have critiques of Messianic Judaism and the Jewish community as well, right? So you can have disagreements, but overall see how God is using both communities. So that's what bilateral ecclesiology means, is that we believe that, and this is where us as a Messianic Jewish community, that we believe that we are part of the body of Messiah, yet also a distinct part of it, right? We don't have the same roles and calling as Gentile Christians do. That we have a specific, that we work together, and that we're not more saved or less saved. It's bilateral in that sense, but that we have a distinct role that is different than Gentile Christians. Does that make any questions? I know it's a lot to unpack, maybe. Phoebe.
Before Stephen was appointed, there was that intersection where they were all together.
Right.
And there was a cohesiveness, but then after time, there arose among them, like, we've been ignored, you are being catered to, and we are just...
Right, with the Greek-speaking Jews, right.
And then Stephen and what was
right.
And to come in to attend to that, so that the focus of the leadership is not to attending to something that they feel should probably not have come up, but still needs to be addressed.
Right. So in that story, the tension is Jewish, because it's like Greek-speaking Jews and Hebrew-speaking Jews, and the Greek-speaking Jews are saying that we're being left out and we're not being cared for properly by the community, right? The disciples say, like, we don't want to deal with this, right? So they appoint, I think it is Stephen and somebody else. They draw lots, I think, in order to determine, or they just appoint people. We'd have to go back and look at the verses. But you see more and more tensions that begin to arise as more and more Gentiles become followers of Yeshua. It creates tensions between, the extended community and internal community, and over time, like who gets to, who makes decisions, and, and it'll take a long time. It's a short amount of time in the point of history, but it didn't happen immediately, where there was, still Gentile followers of Yeshua tended to still worship in synagogues, and and got their direction from the Jerusalem Council. It's when the council is split up and everybody's forced to flee following 135 that not only the vacuum that left, I contributed to, again, I just think some of them were unraveling, and to eventually where there are tensions and there's a reestablishment. By the way, there's a tension here between, and I'm not a specialist in this, so I don't know how to address it exactly. But for example, the origins, for example, in Catholic theology, where Peter is the first pope. Mm-hmm. And so, but the issue is that when you look at church history, and I'm not talking about, this is things everybody agrees with, including Catholics, it's very clear that James is the leader of after the followers of Yeshua, and that Peter and John are what's called the pillars with James of the community. So they're pillars within the community, although James is the head. And until 135, it's those who are in blood relation to the family of Yeshua who are the leaders of the community in Jerusalem. So it's James first. Second, after James is killed, he's martyred, I believe it's Shimon bar Clopas, who is related to the Clopas, who is the brother of Joseph. So, and then after that, I forget, I'm not a specialist I can't rattle off all the names of like who's in this list. But the last Jewish, what Christians call the Pope of Jerusalem, I mean, not the Pope, the Bishop of Jerusalem is, we would just call him the Nasi, or like the head of the community in Jerusalem, is Yehuda Kyriakos, Judas Kyriakos, and he is a great grandson of Jude. So after he's killed during the Bar Kokhba revolt, and from then on, which was crushed horribly. If you think the Romans were terrible after the year 70 when the temple was destroyed, they were even worse by far. They didn't restrain themselves at all after 135. And so from then on, Jews, it'll be, I think, almost 200 years before Jews are allowed back into Jerusalem. And Judea was resettled with Gentiles, and Jews were exiled. And so those who remained went to the Galilee. And so Jewish life was reestablished only in the Galilee, not in the rest of Judea. And so for the next hundreds of years, the Jewish community is no longer based in Judea. They're based only in the Galilee and then other places of the empire. And so after 135, then, everything's decentralized. It already was destabilized after year 70. So after 70, for example, John takes Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and he flees to Ephesus, right? And from there establishes a network of communities. And this happens everywhere that the disciples go. And so this is why I've talked about that two of the most important dates for church history that most Christians have never heard of is 70 and 135. Is because there are contributing factors to the spread of the gospel. Again, we often think that the spread of the gospel message was due 100% to evangelistic fervor, but that's only partly true, right? It's also due to just the realities of the expulsion of Jews from Judea and from Jerusalem itself. So even though Jews after 70 were expelled for a time of Jerusalem, they were never expelled from all of Judea. But after 135, they were. So anyway, eventually Jews could resettle Jerusalem, and the community of Yeshua followers was reestablished back in Jerusalem until 135. After that, the church, if you want to call it that, was no longer based in Jerusalem. From then on, it would move to Antioch. And then from Antioch, I don't know. This is where I get fuzzy in my own knowledge, because I'm just not a specialist on that far into church history. But I know eventually there would be, there's already a believing community established in Rome, but eventually Rome will become very significant. But I don't know why. And that's actually something I'm curious about. It's just I don't have time to do the research on it right now. Is how the church rises to then be based to where you have a Western and an Eastern church. That actually happened pretty early, the division between the two. The Western church is based in Rome under the Pope, right? And the Eastern church is based in Constantinople, which is, I think from Antioch it moves to Constantinople. And today that is Istanbul, which is now Turkey.
I think it was under Constantine that the church got that.
I think you're right. I think you're right that it becomes the center because it becomes the political center. Yeah, I think you know what? I now know you're right. Now that I'm thinking about it, you're absolutely right. That's how obviously it becomes the centers with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity. And so the emperor becomes not only the emperor of the empire, but also the head of the church. So, all right. Any questions so far? Comments? I went on a little bit of a tangent there, I think. All right. So it's okay. It's important stuff that we're talking about history of like, how did we get, like when we think about today, where how did we get to where we have Judaism and Christianity as two distinct entities? It obviously didn't start that way.
And then when you see Passover is coming up, and you're talking to people and they look at you like you've got a third head, and it's
Right.
like, but Good Friday was a Passover celebration. Duh. And they still look at you like you got a third head. It's so bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
It's really bizarre.
No, but it just shows you like how much replacement theology has influenced our thinking. Even when I was reading, because I was
talk about it?
No, I was reading some stuff this week, and it was even saying like, oh, of this like Paschal celebration and stuff. Paschal is Pesach, Passover, right? Paschal. Anytime you see references in reference to Easter or this Holy Week, when it says Paschal, the Paschal sacrifice is the Passover sacrifice, right? Paschal means Passover. But it's just people don't know this. This year is not a great example, only because of the leap year on the Jewish calendar, that Easter and Passover are a month apart. However, normally Christian holidays and Jewish holidays are around the same time because the Christian holidays started as Jewish holidays, right? Easter was part of Passover, right? And so on and so forth. The Christian Pentecost is always around the Jewish Pentecost because that's its origin. Where the difference came was when the church adopted a solar calendar versus the lunar calendar. That means that they're around the same seasons. They're just usually off some days. But in this case, like this year, because of the leap year on the Jewish calendar and the extra month of Adar, they're a month apart rather than just days apart. Because usually Easter is during the week of Passover. So it's not this year just because of it's a leap year. So that's why I said this year is not a good example, but normally the holidays either overlap or are really close around each other because that's the origins of it, or the Jewish holidays. So when we think about like what's the Bible all about, I've talked about before how whenever we say the Bible says, we're doing theology, we're interpreting the text, right? Because you can't hold up the Bible to your ear and listen to it talk. Instead, it's this text and the Bible is not one single text. It's multiple books that were eventually gathered together in the early medieval period and then bound together in a single book. Prior to that, it was never a single book. It was multiple scrolls, right, that would make up these sacred texts. But over time, with the invention of what's called the codex, where a codex is what a book is, where you have printing on both sides and it's bound together in a single, right? Prior to that, people used scrolls. And then with the invention of the codex, you can put more material in something. And eventually all the biblical books were bound to, and once they were decided which of the books are biblical, and with the invention of the codex, they could all be bound together. So that's both a blessing because of convenience, but it's difficult because then people read it all as a single text, and it's really a complicated book written over a vast amount of time, and it requires interpretation. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't see anybody up there or this here.
No, Abe's right here. Oh, it's because I didn't turn in the.
We don't need that.
No, Abe's here. I'm seeing him. It's just that nobody pointed out to me that I didn't turn on the TV behind me. All right. But that's just a monitor. So in just a second, you should be able to see Abe show up on the screen. There he is. See Abe's beautiful face, right? His beautiful punim, we say. All right. So now everybody can see you up there behind me. I am recording it this time, thank God. I went and changed the settings so it would record automatically because I keep forgetting to record it. But by the way, we do have videos for every week. What I've done for a couple of the weeks where I forgot to record is I went back and did a recap recording. I just basically went in my office and later in the week and just kind of did a recap. So we do have recordings of all the weeks of this class. Okay. Any other questions, Teresa? No. Okay. This might take 2 weeks to get through. I think we might have to extend this another. I don't think we're going to get through all of this week, so that's okay.
You're a trooper.
So when we think about so the Bible, because it's a complicated text, it's multiple texts with different genres of literature within it, written over a vast period of time. It requires interpretation. So when we think about the Bible, like what is the Bible all about? One of the things is the sense of progressive revelation, is that over time, God began to reveal more and more, right? You have Genesis, and then from Exodus, right, through Moses and the giving of the Torah, then God revealed more of God's not only self, but God's instructions. And then through and then from the Torah through the prophets, more was revealed. And we get to a point after, for us, the book of Revelation, that we believe that kind of scriptural canonization came to an end. Not that God still doesn't communicate with us, but we no longer consider anything else that came after the canonization process canon, right? But what that means is that as we read through the Bible, that God's progressive revelation is that Moses understood more than Abraham did. Not that he knew God better necessarily, but he got more instruction, right? Abraham didn't have all the same requirements. That this is why, for example, Isaac and who marries two sisters? Oh no, Isaac does with Leah and Rachel. Yeah, Jacob. Who did I say? I meant to say Jacob. So Jacob marries Rachel and Leah. But later, according to the Torah, that would be forbidden. So how can he do that? It's because he hadn't received the Torah yet. The Torah wouldn't be revealed until Moses. And so there's this sense of progressive revelation. There are things that later, once we had more and more of a better picture of what's going on, right? And the same thing with Yeshua. Yeshua's, the life of Yeshua and everything builds on what came earlier, right? The Torah serves as the original foundation. The prophets build on that. The writings build on that, and then the New Testament builds on that. So there's this sense of progressive revelation. Let me just hit a couple more things, and then we'll wrap up for today. How you understand the role of Israel in the nations will determine how you understand Scripture. If you understand that God has this unique purpose for Israel and the nations, as we talked about earlier, we believe that there's both this sense of a responsibility to the Torah, as well as, as a Messianic Jewish community, our commitment to the renewed covenant, the New Testament. And we've talked about before how I believe that it's not just me, but meaning like our belief here at Simcha Israel is that we believe that in Jeremiah 31:31 is the first time there's ever, and it's the only place there's a mention of a new covenant, right? A renewal of the covenant is really how it should be better understood. That when God says, behold, I will renew the covenant that I made with the house of Israel, and it will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors. Instead, I will put it within them, and no longer will anyone need to say no God, for everyone will know God, right? And so we believe that the fulfillment of that promise that God will renew the covenant that he made with Israel and internalize the Torah within us is in John 1, the incarnation, that the Torah became flesh and dwelled among us, and we beheld his Shekhinah, his glory, right, as of the Father's only Son, it says in John 1:18. And so that is the fulfillment. But when we talk about the Torah, automatically this sets us so differently than most other believers. As some of you mentioned, you'll mention Passover or whatever, and people look at you kind of crazy, right? There's this quote here from Ariel and Devorah Berkowitz, who are leaders in Israel. And if somebody wants to read that quote, the middle of where it says the Torah.
I'll read it.
Yeah, go for it, Abe.
Most evangelical Bible colleges and seminars do not even have an area of study called Torah. In contrast, however, the study of the Torah is one of three main areas of study in yeshivot, Jewish religious training institutions, and Jewish seminaries. This means, according to scholar David Stern, that at least 1/3 of the material studied by potential rabbis is hardly even considered by evangelical believers. Is it any wonder that when followers of Yeshua, Jesus, get together with Jewish people who do not yet know their Messiah, there is very little to talk about? Torah Rediscovered, page 1.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Abe. So I think they make a great point here, is that when you don't even consider Torah, which I think has problematic implications for studying then the New Testament, right? Because it serves as a foundation, that even in our connection with, meaning believers in Yeshua to Jewish people, like, what is there to talk about if you're not even familiar with any of this stuff? I mean, like, the Bible, but in any sense of like what the Torah is on a whole. So I think this is a good place to kind of pause. So next week, Abe, there's not going to be I'll take questions in just a second. I just want to mention really quick, since I'm thinking about it. And just so for Abe, we're having a special like weekend of Shabbaton where we're doing a joint service with a local congregation, and we're going to have a guest speaker and stuff. So we're not going to do this class next week, but I think we will need one more class to finish this up, and then I'll do one class on Passover. So because we're not going to get through all of this today. I was a little too ambitious, I guess, when I put this together, which is okay. So any questions of anything we've covered so far, or just in general? You had your hand up. No? Okay. Okay, I thought I saw your hand. It's okay. You're allowed to scratch your head. I just want to make sure I don't miss anybody's questions.
If there's no class next, say half of me, because she won't be here next week.
Oh no, you're not going to be here next week? Well, may God bless your travels.
So you're going to have a class next week, but it's not going to be on this.
There will be stuff going on, but it won't be related to this particular class, and I'm not sure. We'll have to see if we end up. So far, there hasn't been discussions about doing it online, but maybe we can do the Q&A, because we're going to do like an Ask the Rabbi, and we're going to have the different rabbis who are here next week as like a panel, and you can ask the rabbis any questions you want. Yeah. And so maybe what we can do, Abe, is try to have that, so that way there's still something. It just won't be this particular class.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you just email me the dates.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll have Dorothy do that.
Okay.
So I know I covered a lot, and it was more like theological this week, but was there any other questions or comments or?
We're talking about the Lord's revelation that he went kind of increasing, where when he said in Exodus 6, he said, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, God Omnipotent, but I did not reveal my name, Yahweh, to you.
Yeah, Adonai, yeah.
Progressive
revelation. Right. That there were things that weren't revealed yet. They just didn't understand, right? And in the same way, those who came following Yeshua had more of the revelation than those who before. And it doesn't mean that, obviously, Abraham wasn't saved or anything like that. It just means that they had more of the picture of the puzzle than, those who came earlier only had pieces of the puzzle, where, I mean, it's not like we have the entire picture, but we have much more of a picture of things than even like Abraham did, or even Moses, right?
I think Paul also said we know in part, right?
Right. And we see in part. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Shavua Tov. Have a great week. So in 2 weeks, then we'll continue this class. So we'll do one more on this particular class, and then we'll talk about Passover. So Avinu Malkeinu, I pray for the week ahead that you would watch over us and bless us. And for those who are traveling, then that you would watch over them, and God, just healing whatever needs are out there, that you would do your work. And so we lift up this time to you in the name of Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Abe. We'll see you later.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Shavua Tov. Have a good week.